Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited about this panel today. The topic of discussion is the new digital workplace, data-driven insights on the future of work. We've got a phenomenal panel representing a lot of different areas of commercial and corporate real estate that we're going to be talking with today. So our first panelist is Pei Wu, who's Executive Managing Director at Cushman & Wakefield. Good morning or good afternoon, Pei. Corey Clark, VP of Product Management from RXR Realty. We're also joined by Ashley Lippitt, Strategic Partner at CBRE. And last but not least, Drew DePriest, Global Digital Workplace Solutions and Strategy at CBRE. My name is Darlene Pope. I'm pleased to have recently joined PlanOn, IWMS workplace software company, as the President of North America. So this is one of my first public appearances in my new role. So happy to be here. And happy to also have this great panel to talk about digital workplace. So we're going to kick it right off. One of the things that, actually, before I kick it off, Mickey, do you want to go ahead and let the audience know how to submit questions for the panel?
Yes, for everyone in here, my name is Miki Takeuchi, and you can find me in the upper left-hand section, utilizing the chat function on the lower bottom section. You can send a chat to me. So if you have any questions, please send them my way, and then I will send them to Darlene to address.
Great, thank you. So yes, I like to run a very interactive panel, and we will take as many questions as possible from the audience. If you can send those to Mickey, Mickey will forward them to me, and I will attempt to fit them into the conversation at some point in the next hour. So we go from 12:15 to 1:15. The first thing I want to do is kick off with the conversation about, first of all, this is not a COVID conversation. I'm going to put that out there. We're talking about the future of work, regardless of whether or not we're trying to get through a global pandemic. I think a lot of the digital workplace components that we're going to be addressing are really best in class, best practices that building owners and occupants should have been thinking about before the pandemic, and certainly need to be putting in their long-term roadmaps. So hopefully COVID will be behind us in the next couple of months, and we can move forward with the new normal, as they say. So with that, let's talk about what it means to have a digital workplace. And Drew, I'm going to kick off with you. I know you've spent a lot of time, you've got a lot of experience in this space. So from your perspective, tell us a little bit about what you consider a digital workplace.
Sure thing. So to me, the concept can be quite big. It can mean different things to different people depending on who you ask. But in my experience, a digital workplace is something that combines elements. It's a system of systems, and those systems can be building systems. They could be the HVAC, the lighting, the things that provide comfort in a physical space. They're also the business systems, the collaboration, communication, all of the tools, really the full stack of technology that any employee can use regardless of which office they're in, if they're working remotely, with the ultimate goal of really creating the most seamless experience that just works for any of the activities that somebody needs to do throughout the day.
Mm-hmm. So Pei, I know, when you're looking at building operations and all the data that's coming out of buildings, there's terabytes of data that we could potentially collect real time and get insights on. But from your perspective, how do you define a digital workplace?
So, I think the industry has evolved quite a bit in defining that. I kind of view it as it's a network of physical and virtual, I'm going to use quote unquote arenas, because it's not really a space anymore. And all really for the purpose of enabling both work and experiences. And what goes along with that, I would echo what Drew said, seamless is the word, because you need to sort of train people, you need to have the right processes, you need to have the technology that enables that, and then you've got to have the right governance. So that's how I would think about it.
So Corey, from an RXR perspective, what is your definition of digital workplace?
I would define it as the fundamental difference kind of between digital workplace and, let's say, analog, like whatever we was before digital, is choice. Like, I think it's giving employees choice and that flexibility. When if you look at like other industries that have made that shift to digital, like retail, it was, I could only go to the store in my neighborhood. Then I could go online and I can pick from thousands of stores. And I think that same thing's happening in the workplace, where it used to be I could go to office to work. Now I can go anywhere to work. And that is to me, like the really fundamental difference between digital and non-digital workplace.
And Ashley, from your perspective, what do you consider a digital workplace?
Well, I think the team has covered most of what I would say. I might add one other thing, which is I think that when we're thinking about a digital workplace, we're also thinking about proving out outcomes for how we work, which is a little bit different. Through having a digital workplace, we can not just say what are the inputs around all of those, system of systems and comfort and the seamlessness, but actually what does that mean for employees and people, and how we are most productive, are happiest, and how we really think about the digital backing of the enterprise of working.
So Pei, in terms of digital workplace, I know that there are a lot of different metrics that maybe the real estate world has been used to collecting to kind of measure the efficiency of space and the efficiency of the buildings and things like that. But what are you seeing in terms of kind of the change in the metrics and the data that we need to collect, and also the change in who's asking for that data?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because I think we've, for a couple of decades now, have been putting data into real estate systems, and whether that's, one-off applications versus IWMS systems like Plan-On. And part of the challenge, of course, is, data for data's sake really doesn't do a lot for what we all need to make decisions. And so what I'm finding in recent conversations with clients is that the evolving thinking around, in the past, it used to be really surrounded around square foot and around cost, balancing doing more with the same or doing more with less. Nowadays, there's a huge pivot around the employee and sort of centering the metrics around the employee base. There's both a quantitative as well as a qualitative aspect to that. So it's not enough to just measure dollars and cents and things that you can measure in all of your building management systems, which we all do tons of. There's an element of the so what, like what is this data telling me? So if you've got a dashboard that you're serving up, like how is it informing what I need to do in terms of a decision on a footprint or a decision on how to enhance the experience in the space. And so I think, they are asking different questions and they're also asking to measure different things. And it really depends on the stakeholder that you're dealing with, which more and more is changing, right? So, you've got HR at the table, you've got technology at the table, and, the finance has always been at the table. And so, so really kind of catering to that. And then there's also the legal and liability aspects of it, which I think, can't be underestimated in terms of the impact of how companies make decisions.
So Corey, I know we've already touched upon a little bit the different stakeholders and all the different disparate systems, and the way that people typically deploy technology is as individual point solutions. So can you talk a little bit about the value and the criticality of integration in all of these disparate systems, and the need to kind of have that single source of truth for all this data that we're collecting in the buildings?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's, we've been on our side focused on building kind of an integrated solution for a couple of reasons. Like one is, for benchmarking, even just be able to get all the data from all of our different buildings across the portfolio, so we can start to look across that and have that kind of comprehensive view. But the other is like to sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, in terms of trying to collect all the different sources of truth across your portfolio, and really have that place to aggregate everything so you have one single source of truth for all of your data.
Yeah, no, the other is on the correlation piece. And, particularly now that, people are shifting towards different modes of working, and, even like occupancy is changing to being less about occupancy, more about presence and who is there at the right time. the correlations between occupancy and air quality, or occupancy and, you know, employee engagement. And that is, you know, with the questions that kind of our tenants are starting to ask us, and we want to be able to say, oh, are the people that show up more engaged or less engaged? Are they collaborating more? And so getting an integrated solution where we can have sources of data around employee behavior, around their engagement, around occupancy, around air quality, around energy consumption, and starting to look at those across the different metrics, that's, to me, the value of that integration piece.
No, I think that's great. Drew, do you want to carry on that conversation a little bit further in terms of, you know, what is the value of making sure you have that single source of truth and being able to correlate different data sets?
Sure, and I would build a bit on what Corey has laid out. That's long been really the goal, starting from the smart building world. Darlene, where you and I first crossed paths a number of years ago, is looking at purely from operations. If you can get data from every sensor, if it's indoor air quality, if it's airflow, if it's water flow, to eventually optimize a building from an energy perspective using effectively similar statistics methods that industries like finance have been doing for a long time. You know, you can run a multiple regression model on 4 different stock prices going back 30 years and generally be able to predict what one will do 6 months from now. We're finally able to start applying that. So when we talk about machine learning or predictive, you know, scenarios from a building, the fact that over the last 5 years, that data set has started to expand to include things around business systems. So you can look at how often, what team are people using tools like Zoom, like WebEx, like their productivity suite, along with sensors to detect physical presence. To put all of these things into a single place is going to require some level of translation to get all of the data to make sense alongside each other. And then plugging those things, and I know we're going to talk about data models and digital twins and that kind of thing later, but now that the technology is there to do it, it's super important that the data can be put alongside of each other to be able to make sense of those kinds of correlation.
So Ashley, when we talk about digital workplace and people are first starting on their digital workplace journey, you know, what is one of the #1 data sets that they need to be looking at in terms of collecting that data, reporting that data, and using that data to make better decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, occupancy still remains king here, I think. And in the world that I'm currently living in with our team at HANA, as we really think about how we're working with complex enterprise portfolios to help them understand the way that they can leverage a flexible workplace environment, occupancy remains one of the areas that those teams and just teams across the board have long desired to have access to, but now actually it's more relevant to different groups. So I think that you know, as Pei said, we have HR teams thinking about occupancy in ways that they hadn't before because they recognize that this is going to affect the way that we solution across the enterprise. I'd also say, just back to that prior question, I think one real way to just think about the overarching value of this integrated data system and the fact that different teams are looking at data sets that they hadn't before is, I think historically we've all had the opportunity to go at data with a hypothesis in mind. Like, I wonder what this looks like or that looks like, X, Y, and Z. And then we try and test out those hypotheses against the data we have. But now with these integrated data sets, actually we can do a discovery approach as well, where we say, all right, now we have all these data, let's just see what's bubbling to the top. And that often requires having different folks who have different levels of understanding of the data, whether they're novices looking at occupancy or whether they're people who are really well versed in smart data systems and thinking about air quality and light quality and all of those things, to work together in ways that they hadn't before. And so I think that it also means that we have the opportunity to steward them through like what actually matters in even looking at those data that they've heard about before.
Right. And let's stick with that theme in terms of occupancy and what data matters. So Pei, what are you seeing in terms of, you know, who are the stakeholders that need occupancy data, and what are some of the use cases that they're using that data to solve for. Because I know there's so many different use cases for occupancy data, whether it's from the building owner's side or the tenant's side or the facility manager's side. So let's talk a little bit about who are the stakeholders and what are some of the use cases for occupancy data.
Sure. I think it's interesting when we start to look at what's inside the box versus what's within the network, right? If we started this conversation with the definition of digital workplace, where my definition, it's a network of arenas where people work, or have experiences around work. What I find interesting is that when you look inside the box, right, and whether it's the occupier company looking for the data versus, Corey at RXR looking for the data as a landlord, I think there's an element of trying to define within the box of what is the demand? How do you guess at the demand when nobody actually knows, right? And because the footprint and that network of spaces is changing, and it's changing based on not only in aggregate from a company level perspective, but it's like business unit by business unit, job by job. That whole assumption of if I build it, they will come is no longer the case. So I think the landlords are trying to look at it from the standpoint of how do I predict or give some evidence and data around the actual number of people who are going to walk into the box. And what does that mean from a servicing perspective? And it goes right down to the janitorial business that, the most basic level janitorial business of how frequently do you clean? From an HVAC perspective, where Drew talked about, sort of measuring for air quality, how do you actually make sure that what the predictive and preventive maintenance aspects of it? So I think the building management, the landlord side of the house absolutely is very interested in it. When you look inside the company, the thing that is quite interesting is also it goes beyond real estate, right? So now all of a sudden you've got people who are interested in corporate travel. They want to understand where people are. Are they getting on a plane? The network of bodies that are showing up in different places. And then where do you actually geographically locate your spaces? So you get people who are interested within the corporate environment. Business leaders are trying to figure it out. HR is trying to figure out where to attract jobs based on the skills that are needed in any affinity geography. And then how do you actually balance that equation, right? Because that equation is changing. And so I think that part is tough. So it's both an inside the box and an outside the box question.
Yeah, no, I like that, because just based on that, so what you're saying is the actual definition of digital workplace has changed. So it's not just the in the box, what data can we collect from what we used to consider the workplace, to guess what, now the workplace is anything that can be digitally connected. And
yeah,
so that
absolutely.
that's your home, that's the Starbucks, that's the plane. And it is now the digital workplace is a much, much broader landscape. And there's even people talking about what data do we need to collect from our employees, even if they're not physically inside the box. In terms of, if you consider the digital workplace, any place you can be digitally connected to work, then from a real estate perspective, the outside the box part is going to be 10 times harder than the inside the box part. And I think that in the past, we've always talked about digital workplaces inside the box. What's the data inside the box? So I really like the fact that you've completely broadened the definition to reflect what's actually happening, which is digital workplaces everywhere, wherever you could possibly sit to digitally connect to work. So let's go back to Corey, though, from a landlord perspective. And again, and I don't care if you talk inside the box or outside the box, but from an RXR perspective, from a landlord perspective, what types of data are you looking at? We were specifically talking about occupancy. And is this data that you're collecting for the benefit of RXR as the real estate company, or are you also being asked to provide data to the tenants or the occupants for their purposes as well? So again, let's kind of go back to occupancy use cases. And Corey, let's hear a little bit on your perspective.
Sure. So yeah, we're collecting data for ourselves just to, of course, know if our buildings are being used, but the main consumer that we're focusing on is actually the tenant, and providing data as a service, along with the other services we provide for the building. And what they've been asking for is not quite occupancy. A lot of our tenants, there's a few that their leases are renewing, and maybe there's a forcing mechanism and they're going to change their space requirements, but most of them aren't making any drastic moves right now. They're kind of playing wait and see. And so while they're interested in occupancy to know if their space is being used, they're a little more interested in, I would say, presence and identifiable, or tying identity to occupancy. So they don't want to know just that there was 100 people today, but which 100 people, because as they're moving to these more hybrid models, they want to understand if they're getting the value out of the space in terms of collaboration. If I have 200 people in the office and 100 people show up on Monday, Tuesday, and 100 show up on Wednesday, Thursday, I have a siloing problem, and people will never meet and never collaborate. So how do I make sure we have the right people coming at the right time? And that seems to be the kind of occupancy presence question that we're getting, more than do I have enough people, or
Right.
to make the space worth its money.
Right, right. And Drew, I think the definition of occupancy is also changing, or people have different definitions of occupancy, because there's a difference. And I found this out with a client recently where we were talking about their occupancy rates, and their occupancy rates are at 85%. And I was like, how could your occupancy rates possibly be 85% right now? And what they were referring to was assigned seating as occupancy. And so I think there's different definitions in the workplace around what's considered occupied. So there's kind of physical presence, which, is butts and seats kind of measurement, versus utilization, which is kind of an average of butts and seats, versus assigned. So Drew, the question around this then is, first of all, how do we get to a point where we're all defining the same terms? And how do you measure the different types of occupancy? And what's the most important metric with occupancy? So
this has been one of the most fascinating parts, I think, of the last probably 2 to 3 years, is watching the evolution of sensors. 15 years ago were just for energy savings with indoor air quality and carbon dioxide. And now, to your point, every conversation that my team and I start with any enterprise company around sensors are, what are the things you're trying to solve for? Let's start with outcomes, because generally, like you're saying, occupancy, adoption, utilization can mean, it could be a binary, are people coming in or not? It could be, if they are coming in, how are they utilizing the space, down to the point where we're counting chairs in a conference room to understand strategy and space layout design. So we've seen, as examples, a number of companies who have said, we think we have a problem with not having enough huddle spaces. Can you help us verify that? We've gotten a little bit into pathing as well, which is more of a retail challenge than it is a workplace challenge, but we've seen sensors apply there. We had a large retail client in Europe last summer want to understand how sales performance of a coffee outlet compares based on store layout. And with sensors, you can do that we had heat maps where you could follow how long somebody spends at each part of the store. And then this company would then compare that to actual dollars, and that determined how they laid out the store. So I think combining that along with some things that Pei and Corey have talked about, just the concept of analytics coming out of the tools that we use on our laptops more frequently, of understanding who do I collaborate with most frequently, who do I not talk to, how much time do I spend in meetings. Eventually you can aggregate all of these things together to drive physical design, how and when people should be assigned or requested to come in. It's just, there's a lot of data that's out there. And the big challenge now is just, how do you make sense of everything together?
No, I think that's great. And we're kind of talking about different definitions for the same term, which I think is kind of leading us towards data governance, making sure that we've got the right naming conventions, making sure that the systems are speaking the same language. So Pei, I know that you've done a lot of work in the area where you're looking at data governance, data management, data standards. Let's talk about that a little bit, because when we've got all this data coming in from all these different directions, how important is it to have some type of data governance to make sure we've got quality data and we don't have garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you start to think about both the supply side and the demand side being what I'll call fractionalized, right? So what ends up happening is that when the data that's tracked at the point of where the information is generated, if the setup and the person is not entering according to the strategy intent, it's like a thread, sort of you pull on a thread in the sweater, right? So when I reflect back, and this goes back probably over a decade, where Deloitte, was one of the companies that had, at scale, right, mobility strategy, and the build out, you design according to a sharing ratio, you get to the operationalizing level, and you have an operations manager on site who was not part of that decision process. And in the setup of how they mobilize the actual management of that space, they started assigning people, and that data went into the system. And now all of a sudden, what you design in strategy actually was broken in operations, right? And that's just one example. Now, if you kind of think about across the many accounts that we have in the region, and for every account you set up and having the right systems and data talking to each other, that governance is so important, because foundationally, when you're reporting on your KPIs and SLAs, it's on the base of whatever it is that you're measuring. And if the actual foundation is not done correctly, then the data could be very wrong. And so we just spent a lot of time in transitioning accounts to make sure that attention is there. But I as much as you can throw bodies at it, I think, fundamentally, it's still not a perfect process, and it's not perfect because systems have to talk to each other. And then, at the point of translation, people are not necessarily 100% on the same page. So I personally view that as an industry, we are sorely, sorely lacking that data standard and the governance, that we should just punch it out, right? So, every time you're building a new building, every time, you are taking over a property management contract, that same set of data should be used, from one to the next. I think, Drew and Ashley, you guys are nodding your heads like, sometimes we are on the recipient of, each other's data sets. And I'm sure, that we could make our jobs easier for each other if we were better about it. So,
yeah. So Ashley, let's continue then on, data governance, quality of data, and how important is that in terms of, putting together your overall data or digital workplace strategy?
Yeah, I would echo what Pei said. And I think the thing that's really important, the key that I just heard Pei say, which is that we're, it's an imperfect process right now. And so one of the pieces, in addition to the governance and figuring out how to have standards and a shared set of definitions, is also being really clear when we are drawing conclusions from data, that we qualify them around the quality of the conclusion we can draw. So I know that sounds a little complicated, but like Drew was mentioning, we're at the place where we're running models, and we might have to be really clear, like all other disciplines, or like they do in other industries, financial industries, or in my background of, education, where I worked for the federal government. And when we ran models, we said, look, this is based on a single case. It doesn't mean that it's not valid and that we can't draw conclusions from it, but let's qualify that this is not the universal standard. We don't have thousands and thousands of data points. But where we do have those data points, understanding that there is also going to be quality problems within. And I think that there is there's an opportunity to opt in across industry to really sharing these data, sharing data sets, and understanding that some of this is just going to be table stakes at this point, right? Like, I think that as an industry, we've often been a little bit hesitant. And I wonder whether there's an opportunity for us to all universally agree that there should be this shared governance, that we should kind of pull back the veil so that we can elevate the industry across the board. And then, Darlene, to your question, that really gives us a deeper understanding of that digital workplace as being this new definition of what Pei is talking about, where we say, look, if these are the standards, anything that touches this part of the data set is something that we need to consider. And then what does that mean for us to share across teams? I think that we could certainly help each other out and recognize that that there are inefficiencies in data governance and data modeling and using the data that actually hurt the employee, right? Like that they hurt the people using these systems. And I know we really, I think could really help each other out by being more efficient on that front. It would take a lot of work. So we have to, agree, but I think that there are some interested parties.
No, absolutely. So Corey, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the process of where you start, because we've talked a lot about the data, which is once you already have it, reporting it, looking at correlations, et cetera. But if we take a couple steps back, I think we need to also focus on business drivers and functional requirements before we start talking about technical requirements. So talk to me a little bit about how you kind of start on this digital strategy, and how important is it to have a roadmap to know where you're going before you start?
It's a good question. It's definitely important to have some sort of roadmap. I think, Drew mentioned it, it's come up a couple times, but, focusing on the problem you're trying to solve with the data, because, depending on the problem you're trying to solve, the source of data may vary, and details really matter. Like with, badge data will get me ins, so I can get peak occupancy, but I don't get outs, so I don't really know the volatility of change. So like, if I really need to know when people are in the building and when they're not, it's a different data source. And so having real clarity on the kind of question you're trying to answer with the data is a huge driver, at least for how we've been looking at it and focusing. The other is, for us, because we have such a heterogeneous portfolio, it's some buildings are over 100 years old, some are under construction. Finding like the kind of consistency across the data and what is consistently accessible. So trying to avoid the lowest common denominator, but knowing what data that we can get in every single building all the time, is another big driver. Just the general availability, because there's a lot of cool data out there, but it involves a ton of hardware, a lot of installation, and there's not the ROI. And so trying to find how we can, what data we already have and how to leverage that.
Yeah. So let's continue on that thought, Corey. When you say, start with the data that you have.
Yeah.
But then you also mentioned when you're looking at a longer term roadmap and the data that you're going to need, what are the components in terms of physical infrastructure or equipment and software that are needed to get to the outcome? So there's kind of what do we have now? What do we need to add in order to get to the outcome? So let's talk a little bit about physical equipment, software, what's required in the middle to get it from point A to point B.
Yeah. It's, some of it's just boring stuff, like, like good networking, fiber, we need to get the data out of the building. Obviously, that's been an interesting challenge in some of our older ones. We've been focusing a lot on edge compute and actually having, smart hardware at the edge that we can use to process the data on site. One for speed and performance. And this data that we couldn't get otherwise, and we can process video camera footage in real time. But the other is privacy. And making sure that only kind of anonymized aggregate data leaves the building, and we're not kind of leaking private information. So like security is the other lens, and privacy, like, so that we kind of look at all of our data through and try and take a privacy first perspective. But yeah, and that also feeds into the hardware. Like we've looked at, and I'm sure we all have, like 100 different occupancy sensors, and they vary from extremely private and useless in terms of the amount of information, that just tells me that there was a body somewhere at some point in the space, or computer vision that can tell me who it is, what shirt they're wearing, what their favorite color is, and finding the right solution in there that gets us the data we want, but doesn't violate the privacy of the end user, is another big kind of deciding factor in terms of that hardware roadmap and process.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to talk a little bit about data security and privacy. So Drew, I'm going to have you kick off or continue that line of thinking. When you've got all this data, and a lot of it is personal data, what do you need to do to make sure that you're protecting the security of that data, and more importantly, really protecting people's individual privacy?
Sure. So I think building off what Corey had finished on, I think there's two paths to look at this. There's the technical answer, and then there's the optics and the change management of having that device physically in the space. And we've worked with companies in the past who, this was 2 summers ago, had a very specific need. They wanted to understand intent of how someone was using a conference room. Instead of just counting chairs, it was, is someone at the whiteboard? Is someone standing up and presenting? Is everyone sitting around a table? And at the time, 2 years ago, the only solution was this big giant bubble of a security camera that had computer vision running on the top of it. And just the sheer sending a photo of that to the head of real estate shot down the project faster than anything else could have. So there's a degree of change management, even when people see a passive infrared that Corey's talking about that can only detect if a person is physically there. I've seen instances where someone sees that, assumes it's a foreign device, and they either pull it off the wall or they unplug something or they call security and say, hey, what was this? So in a pragmatic deployment, there's a very strong degree of change management that has to go in to even say to everyone, here's what we're doing, this is why, this is what it's collecting, this is what it's not collecting. And then as you look at it through the second lens of more of the technical security piece, most every sensor provider that we talk with these days will have their own method of even getting the data out of the building. Typically that will rely on some kind of a cellular backhaul connection, or will ask to run their own separate dedicated internet line if it's DSL or cable, what have you. I've yet to meet any large enterprise company who will allow a sensor to sit on their corporate network. It's just too much of a risk. So being able to design around that, and then from there, and we briefly talked about, where does the data go? And in many cases, to get everything into a single place, if that's a corporately owned data lake, or if it's a data visualization tool like a Tableau or a Power BI, does that need to come back inside the wall? Does that tool live on-prem? So it's step one is getting the data out securely, which seems to be fairly straightforward these days. But then the full process of where does it go? How do we access it? What APIs are available? You get into encryption, that becomes the next part.
Mm-hmm. Well, even getting the data out, you mentioned that, you may have an instance where you've got CO2 sensors that have their own gateway that are going over a cellular connection to a third-party vendor. Then you've got your energy meters that are connecting to a central energy meter that then is connected to a router that's then going to another third-party vendor. Then you might have your occupancy sensors, which for some reason the IT department did put on the corporate network, and they're being collected and then sent over the corporate IT connection back to headquarters so we can track occupancy. So already there, you have 3 different data sets going over 3 different types of connections out of the building to 3 different locations. And so how do we solve that problem? And Drew, I'm going to come back to you because you kind of were the one that pointed out that we still, even with that model, getting the data out is still clunky. Disparate systems, multiple sources of cybersecurity risk because you're going out over insecure cellular or third-party vendors, and then you have all of your data in different places. You got it in this cloud, in that cloud, you got it on-prem, you've got it on the network. I mean, it's a mess. Peg, I see you shaking your head, so I'm coming to you next on this one. But Drew, I guess my first question is, how do you fix that?
Yeah, my personal favorite is the next conference room you walk into, just look up. The average you're going to see an occupancy sensor, one for the lighting, one for the AV to turn the display on, and one for utilization, and none of them talk to each other. So the only way to approach this is for either your consulting engineer early in a project, if it's a new build, or whoever owns that internally from an enterprise IT perspective, is to get buy-in from everyone responsible for the network, for security, to try to find a way to segment out some part of a network, create some kind of a VLAN or something specific whose sole intent is for data to be shared back and forth amongst these various systems. At this point, there are enough protocol translators and enough RESTful APIs where a building automation system should be able to talk to an IoT solution. A lot of clients are going down the path of building their own data lake, where they just give you a data schema and say, here, push into this once every 10 minutes. So it's just a lot of pre-planning and strategy to avoid the triple censoring.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and Pei, we can continue this dialogue on getting the data out in the first place, and the fact that I think within the organization there are different stakeholders trying to get data for their particular use cases, and so you end up with, as I said, CO2 going this way, and energy going this way, and occupancy going that way, and temperature going to the engineers, and everybody's got, I need this data, so I'm going to solve for it my own way. And I'm not concerned about how it shares with all the other data sets. So how do you solve for that?
Every company has a slightly different approach to it, and it fundamentally comes down to the amount of resources, right? So, if you've got a large scale account where there's the ability to have dedicated tech teams, right? Certainly those are going to be much more seamless. The reason I was, sort of chuckling, nodding my head is that it's the age-old conundrum of how fragmented real estate technology is, and the fact that it's being paid for and deployed by so many different people within an organization, right? Actually, at one point, Cornet New York hosted a session around, in this case, physical security, with the active shooters, and there were actually 3 different startups that were on the panel. One of them was tracking a sensor that read for gunshots. One of them was tracking a visual, sort of read of shapes of all different kinds of guns of different types. And the other one was, one that could be deployed by a landlord, where you can have at any point in time, have an active real-time read of what activities were happening in the building. And all 3 vendors were on this panel talking to heads of real estate and their teams. And yet, the 3 of them had 3 different approaches, and it's one buyer, and more often than not, it's the head of security that is influencing the decision, and real estate is fronting the capital, right? So that's an example of why it's so difficult in this industry, because the factor of that matter is there's just no easy button trying to connect all of this. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of work by our tech teams. It takes a lot of work by the business stakeholders to make a case for why this is important. And it's fighting for limited investment, which I'm sure, we're all very aware of these days.
Well, and I think that's a great example. And I guess I have to ask the question, out of those 3 vendors and three different solutions, were they all coming up with different results from the data?
Well, so they were all tracking different aspects of whether or not there's threat on premises, right?
Yeah.
So they were all after the same outcome, with 3 different technologies. And all 3 of them also had the ability to alert, the police and, the municipality that something was going on. And so now you got 3 different vendors, 3 different technologies making 3 different phone calls to 911.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think you see that across the board, even with occupancy. You've got the security team looking at CCTV data. You've got the IT group looking at network login. you've got badge swipe data, you've got corporate real estate putting in sensors, and you've got 4 or 5 different stakeholders within the organization trying to solve for the same data sets, which I think goes back, and Ashley, we'll go to you on the next, on this one, the importance of putting together a roadmap, right? Understanding the outcomes that you're trying to solve for before you start putting in the solutions to get there. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the plan for digital workplace, starting with what you have now and where you want to go. What happens in the middle?
Yeah, well, and I think one of the big problems, Darlene, with what you just mentioned, with those different stakeholders looking at the data, in some cases you have no action that comes from that, right? Because then there's, not necessarily any ownership of who should be moving on some of these inputs and data. And I think you can add to that another layer of, and to this conversation, the fact that the data standards are different across geographies, right? So we experience a lot, and certainly I'm sure, Pei, that you do, that when we're talking about what happens here in the States versus what happens with EU standards, et cetera, I mean, these are really big and, conflicting challenges. I think what we're finding is that as it relates to pulling all these pieces together and having a clear understanding of governance, that grounding in the fact that there's real value in having a centralized home for data and having a team that understands and can own the various pieces around quality, around definition, and really around understanding how we can bring value to our customers from the CBRE perspective by prioritizing what we want to do with these data first and foremost. So yes, there's lots that we want to do. We think that there's a real opportunity to start with some of these hypotheses around the outcomes that we can drive and really build ownership and clarity for all of the different stakeholders to say, yes, we want to tackle what you're talking about. Here's how we're doing it, right? This is where it sits on the roadmap of bringing those data together so that we can come to some answers. And when you do that, when you look at the infrastructure, when you build a centralized, repository or home, an electronic data portal, what it also allows you to do is say, we think that this question or this outcome is really important, but there's a gap. We're not actually going to be able to get to the answer to that question if we don't assign a group or if we don't get certain stakeholders to start tackling the collection of those data, because otherwise it's going to be incomplete. And then we get back to that quality of conclusion question. So I think that roadmap, really starting with a centralized set of ownership, bringing the right stakeholders to the team, and then figuring out what you can do in the absence of drawing on those data, because we know that our clients are still going to have these questions. So what are the workarounds that will help us get to some level of value, even if it's not on the immediate roadmap?
So Pei and Ashley, I know you mentioned kind of the central data home, and we've talked around having that one single source of truth. So Pei, what's the importance? Talk a little bit about the importance of having a kind of a core platform. And even if you've got disparate systems, being able to bring all that data into at least the same core platform, so you can start to, whether it's reporting, processing, automation, give us kind of a little bit more in-depth discussion about the importance of a core platform.
So, it's interesting because my philosophy around this has evolved. Back in the days of Deloitte Consulting with technology implementation, I think that every company has a core platform that they've invested in, and some are more progressive in that thinking than others. There are ones over the last 10 years that have spent the funds needed to put in place an IWMS system. There are others that are sort of tying together multiple systems, and in those cases, when we have clients who are they're sort of in that setup, Cushman has a Triana technology, which is a business intelligence overlay. And that is the method by which we tie the data for insight. And that goes across strategic analysis and data points to, transactions in the pipeline, to FM stats that the team is tracking, as well as all the cost dimension side of it. So I don't have one single philosophy that sort of is I'm anchoring on right now. And part of it is because clients are so different in their approaches and in what they've invested in. But I also think that you can get there, to Ashley's point around the right outcomes. It's about asking the right questions, and the questions will then inform what data you're actually going to want to track. And then the plumbing that you need to kind of get that connected in order to, get the utility flowing, right? So, so that's kind of my perspective on it, and it's, it has evolved, because Darlene, you and I both know that, 10, 15 years ago, the conditions are such that everybody was running, hard and fast towards the one system, and I think there's been enough advancement where that, that can be a seamless way of doing it. But there are also others where they have been able to tie it together and still get the right outcome. So.
Yeah, we actually have a session this afternoon on worlds colliding, where we've got kind of smart buildings colliding with digital workplace. We've got digital workplace colliding with smart buildings. And so everything's connected. And the criticality of having a core platform when you have that many moving pieces, I think is even more paramount. All right, so Corey, in terms of digital workplace, I think there's kind of a difference between what I would consider a static digital workplace, which is collecting data, historical data, and reporting it to a dashboard, versus active digital workplace, which is live time series data that's being shared among multiple devices. So I think we've kind of moved from old school static digital workplace to what I really want to talk about is the value of active and automated digital workplace. So can you kind of give us your thoughts on that? What are some of the benefits of having that live information and the integration and automation component?
Sure. I think, one thing, and we did circle back to some of the earlier conversations around occupancy, like I think the active data is really critical just because the volatility of needs has increased so much. Like, tenants maybe would look at, reevaluate their space, think of a redesign every 3 years, start looking at a new lease every 7 years, 10 years. Like, there wasn't a highly volatile change. Now, if my entire employee base could decide to come in tomorrow or not, that the degree of volatility is huge. And then also just it would change day to day, hour to hour. So it's the need for like that active data is so much higher now in this new workplace than it was, honestly, 6 months ago or a year ago.
Yeah, and kind of going back to my example when one of our clients said that they were at 85% occupancy, which is what they were referring to is assigned seats, static historical data, as opposed to active live, how many people are in my space right now type of data. So I know we've only got about 5 minutes left. If there's any questions from the audience, feel free to send them in to Mickey. But as kind of closing thoughts on this digital workplace topic, I want to talk about what's next. So once you do have that roadmap in place, and once you do have that core platform and the ability to get all the data in, let's talk about what are some of the outside the box things that we can do with that data going forward. So I'm going to start with Drew on this one. So give me your idea of what's next for digital workplace.
I really like the concept of going beyond scenario planning and getting to a place where both the physical building as well as the digital experience are anticipatory and start taking action on their own. And there's a few small examples that we're starting to see. One in the physical space, we have clients asking now to build an algorithm to dynamically reallocate space and interact with a smart building. So if you have 5 floors and over time you can predict that every Tuesday you only need 2 of them based on whatever your definition of occupancy happens to be, that the next Tuesday that some system automatically shuts down 3 floors and reschedules every meeting, kills all the HVAC and the lighting back to overnight set points and says, all right, cool. We only need 2 floors today. we're just going to go ahead and do it. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think that's the horizon. You can see a little bit of it now with, if you're on Office 365, Microsoft will learn your work patterns. And if you allow it, will automatically block out focus time for you in the following week, which I use. It's great. You can actually get work done. So to me, it's anticipatory buildings that then take action.
Great, great. Kind of that predictive operations going forward. All right, Ashley, what do you see as the future? We've got all that data. What's the next big thing we can do with it?
Yeah, I think the big thing is maybe one of the most almost boring and obvious things, which is I think that there's going to be a shift in the foundational unit of measurement from the way we think about the four walls and the square and measuring just by square foot to measuring more by the individual. So measuring per person. And it's going to be complex to do it, but I think actually there's going to be a shifting lens that's grounded in all of those data being tied to how people really work and those outcomes that we've been talking a little bit about here.
So Pei, what's next? What do we do? We got all this data. We've been solving for different problems. What's an outside the box kind of data use that you see coming in the future?
So, I'm, given that this is not a COVID talk, I'd like to actually look a little bit further out. And even though I'm in the occupier business right now, I am very keen on understanding the tokenization of real estate and where blockchain could take, the data question. And the reason I bring it up is that if you marry blockchain from a commercial real estate side and you take BIM from an asset management side, and the two of those sets of technologies now create the foundation in the built environment stack of data. The question becomes, can that data actually give you a running start on asset management, infrastructure management, and the certification aspects of it that can offer. And then if you get the OEMs tied into that, then maybe, more data could sort of transition seamlessly in the ecosystem. And I'll leave it with one last, just because sustainability is so, hot these days, right? What happens when blockchain also allows you to now suddenly look at the supply chain in terms of embodied carbon? Think about the influence that we can have in the industry around, from cradle to grave, where you source the built materials through the blockchain certification into the building that we're now operating. So that's it's probably going to take decades to get there, but that's what I'm excited about, the potential of that data. So
that's great. That's great. All right, Corey, so you got the last word here. So what do you see as the future of all this data? What's something mind-blowing we can do with it?
It's tough. There's not much left. Taking the cleaner. I think to actually pick up on what Pei was talking about, I think sustainability is an interesting focus, not just on the sustainability of the building, but really looking at sustainability for the entire workforce. And even now, as people are starting to work hybrid and remote, there is this thought that maybe it's more sustainable. People aren't commuting as much. But being able to really understand that impact across in office, at a third place, and remote, and what it means towards energy consumption. Like if I'm working at home, I'm running my air conditioner. Every other remote employer is running their air conditioner. Is there an efficiency of scale in coming into the office, and what are the payoffs there, the trade-offs? So I think having that data both, and what Pei was talking about, the network, not just the space, but every space that's being touched by the workforce has a lot of promise for sustainability, improved experience and productivity.
No, that's great. And great conversation. Thank you for everyone who participated in the panel today. I'm just going to wrap up by saying digital twins. I think we're going to get to a point where, and I'm surprised, I was kind of putting it out there as a softball for everybody, but digital twins in terms of running our buildings, like we're in Minecraft, right? Everything's digital, everything's remote, everything, you get all the different data sets on occupancy and temperature and CO2 and a fan running, and everything happens in a digital world with that digital twin. So I'm really, really excited about what the future has to hold for for that technology. And especially in a world where so many of us are working remotely, and hopefully, again, that won't be much longer, but regardless of whether we're in the middle of a global pandemic, I think the future of digital twins, taking all this data out of the buildings, is absolutely tremendous and mind-blowing. And I think we've only scratched the surface with that. So anyway, thank you again to all the panelists, Corey Clark, Pei Wu, Ashley Lippitt, Drew DePriest. Again, I'm Darlene Pope. Please meet me in the purple conference platform. The Plan On booth is right outside of the exhibit hall. So I'm going to head down there right now. If anybody has any further questions or would like to continue this conversation, I'll meet you at the Plan On booth. Thank you very much. Have a
Thank
good
you.
afternoon. Bye.
Take care.